Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Our guests are Jackson White from Spotlight, PA, Boris Krotchniuk from WVIA, and Terza Christopher from Penn Live. Welcome, everyone.
Hello there.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Jackson, let's start with you. You wrote a story, and the headline reads as follows: as Shapiro opposes ICE detention centers, his GOP opponent stays vague. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so with the ICE detention centers being proposed in Berks and Schuylkill counties, I wanted to see where Republican Stacey Garrity really stood on them. She serves as the state treasurer, and she's running unopposed in the Republican primary to face Shapiro in this year's election. She wouldn't give me a clear answer, her campaign. They said that they would review the proposals. I think the exact quote is warrant serious reviews. And they jabbed at Shapiro for opposing those facilities. But she wouldn't say that she supported them outright or that she would help the Trump administration build them in Pennsylvania. No clear answer there. And that really seemed to be a stark difference between her and the governor right now. His administration is doing a lot to oppose these facilities. I haven't seen a lawsuit yet, but they're using all the state permitting processes that they can through the Department of Environmental Protection to really stall the developments there, saying that those facilities can't open until more answers are given from ICE to what sort of water use those facilities need.
So at this point, it's safe to say that the governor is going at this with practical concerns, short of a lawsuit at this point. And we know the governor has a history of suing President Trump.
Yes, absolutely. I think he touts 19 different lawsuits that he's filed in the past year or so. And other states have actually filed lawsuits to block ICE detentions. I think Maryland is the most recent case. Don't quote me on that one. But yeah, other states are suing, and it's unclear whether Governor Shapiro will need to. His administration hasn't made clear whether they would or not. They tend not to announce whether they're going to file a lawsuit until after it's filed.
All right, thanks very much, Jackson. Boris, I know that you've been writing about, on a related note, immigration county policy in Lackawanna County, and they're debating a policy that could affect their employees' relationship with immigration agents. What's the main issue here?
Well, a couple of months ago, Commissioner Bill Gahan brought up the possibility of coming up with some sort of ordinance to regulate the way the county employees interact with ICE agents. So if an ICE agent comes in the door and wants to see county records, what is a county employee supposed to do? And that was the topic of a lot of debate at multiple commissioner meetings over the last 2 months. A lot of people advocating for it, a few advocating against it, saying that passing an ordinance like that would constitute turning Lackawanna County into a sanctuary county. They finally got it down to a policy rather than an ordinance, and they passed that policy by a 2-to-1 vote yesterday. The two Democratic commissioners, including Bill Gahan, voting for it, and the Republican voting against it. It was quite the issue for a while in Lackawanna County, but now at least there's a policy. It's not what Gahan wanted, but it does create a template for how a county employee is supposed to respond if an ICE agent comes to the door looking for information about someone.
And under certain circumstances, Boris, the employees would have to cooperate with ICE according to this new policy. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, if there's the way the plan was to have them only cooperate if there was a judicial warrant or a court order or a subpoena, rather than the administrative warrant that ICE has been using in different places to arrest people. But that kind of fell through. So now if they present a warrant or a court order, the employee has to basically gather basic information about who the agent is, and then kick it upstairs to a supervisor or the county chief of staff or the county solicitor. And we'll see how that works. It's literally passed yesterday.
Terza, let's get you involved. A couple weeks ago, you wrote a story about the proposal to buy, or rather the purchase has already been made of property in Pennsylvania that could be the home of these immigration detention centers. And briefly summarize that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I covered the press conference where the governor said, he would use every tool at his every tool to block these detention centers. But I did get to talk to DP Secretary Jessica Shirley, who told me how these warehouses were meant for, not meant for people, but meant for boxes and things like that. So one of her quotes to me was, if a nursing home came and asked for a 7,500 bed facility, it would still be hard for us to provide permits for that. So I thought that was interesting.
Let me put this question out to the group. What's the reputation of existing immigration detention centers in other parts of the U.S., and what do we know and what can we learn from their experience?
Oh, well, they're mostly limited right now to county prisons, federal prisons. You don't have the kind of detention centers that they're talking about, and there's going to be 24 of them, 8 of them with about 7,500 people, and 16 of them with about 1,500 detainees. We haven't seen those yet. There's about $38 million set aside to do that, but we really don't know how that's going to work out. The interesting thing about the detention centers that are being proposed is that the court battle has actually already started when the Shapiro administration tried to force the Department of Homeland Security to explain exactly how it's going to make sure that the Clean Streams Act is not available, that the drinking water quality is going to be good. They used the Department of Environmental Protection to order them to come up with all their plans. And normally this stuff is done on a local level, and that was kind of an unusual step. And so they basically gave them 20 days to do it, and the Homeland Security wanted more time. And when they didn't respond in the time that they did, they ended up getting another letter from the department, but then they ended up going to the Environmental Hearing Board, which is where you hear appeals of decisions by DEP. So they're challenging whether or not DEP can do this at the Environmental Hearing Board. The interesting thing about it is that they want to have these centers open by basically Thanksgiving, and the appeal before the Environmental Hearing Board, they're not even supposed to get to a hearing until after the election. So I don't know how that's going to play out. This could end up with an actual lawsuit, but maybe filed by the Department of Homeland Security.
Last question on the detention centers. Then what other tools are at the disposal of the governor for stopping this project that he obviously wants to do?
I don't know. We've never been here before. He's been willing to sue the administration, as Jackson pointed out before. But I found the DEP challenge to be unusual, because usually these matters are decided at the local level. If the sewer authority down there says it doesn't have enough capacity for its sewage treatment plant to manage the sewage created by 7,500 people, then it's their developer's responsibility, Homeland Security, to come up with how that's going to happen. Now they're saying they can do that. It's unclear how they will do that yet, because we haven't seen any actual plans. But this is all really early on. It's got a long way to go until it plays out.
Terza, let's talk about the Republican Leadership Conference that you covered, and let's put it in context first. President Trump's approval ratings are down, so how does that concern the party and whatever discussion took place at this conference?
Yeah, absolutely. The tone of the conference was tense, like I mentioned in my story. there was a straw poll that was conducted, which, all the attendees filled out. And it was interesting. Only 73% of the people who were at the conference approved, for example, the president's decisions around the war with Iran. There were a number of speakers there, like Congressman Scott Perry, Senator Dave McCormick. There were also other advocates like Cliff Maloney from Citizens Alliance, who was talking about how 2026, the upcoming midterm elections, has the potential to be ugly because of some of these approval ratings, and just skyrocketing gas prices, for example, was constantly talked about. I talked to a number of young people, young Republicans. One of them who works for Turning Point Action, and he's planning to run for the Republican State Committee this year. He mentioned while he trusts the president, he also added that he wasn't necessarily pro-war. So there's definitely nuance. There were nuanced perspectives that I heard at this conference.
Well, here's an issue that came up during the conference, and you addressed this in your story. It has to do with something called the Save America Act, and it has something to do with proof of citizenship. Explain, please.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Save America Act, the bill as it is right now, mentions basically would require Americans to prove their citizenship beyond just showing like a driver's license, so a passport, which more only half of Americans do have passports, and it costs to get a passport. So critics say that might make it harder for some Americans to vote. During Senator McCormick's speech, which I noted in my story, he equated the Save America Act to, we show our ID to get a beer, but didn't specify that, you can't show your driver's license to, if the bill passes, you would have to show something more than just a driver's license.
And what do we know about how the American public feels about this in the event it goes through, Tirza?
Yeah, I mean, people who I talked to at the conference specifically, a good number of them were for the Save America Act. And this one gentleman I spoke to from Scranton, who has been coming to this conference for multiple years, mentioned how he believes that federally Republicans aren't fighting enough to push for this act before the elections. I will say other people I spoke to outside of the conference expressed concern about getting a passport on time and being able to register to vote. But at the conference, most people were hoping that this act goes through before the upcoming elections.
So it's interesting to consider, Tirza, that certainly the discussion about the war in Iran came up during the conference, and we know that things happen in that war every couple of days. And so, of course, the general election is still 6 months away.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very volatile situation. Things could change as soon as later today. But I got to speak to Congressman Scott Perry about his thoughts, because he is a retired military official. And I was at a press conference actually the day after President Trump had tweeted or posted on X that, quote, a whole civilization might die tonight. And I asked Representative Perry how he felt about it. He said he trusted Trump, and I asked him about, what do you think about, bombing potentially civilian infrastructure, which is what President Trump had vowed to do at the time. And he did say, he did acknowledge that the Geneva Conventions, protect civilians, but he trusts that the president will stay within, within the law. At the conference as well, there were multiple people who actually declined to comment when I asked them specifically about the war. And I'm talking average people, not elected officials, but at the war too, when it came to skyrocketing gas prices, I know Senator McCormick was asked about that, and he acknowledged that it was a strain, but he also said that this is a war that's been long coming, according to him, and President Trump was the only one to kind of dive headfirst into it. So.
Teresa, just one more question about the conference. What was the mood at the conference with respect to the issue of immigration? And Democrats want Republicans to change the policy, and there hasn't been any indication that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Right, absolutely. Congressman Scott Perry acknowledged, he said something along the lines of, if you're fleeing oppression, we want to help, but if you quote fibbed or quote hate America, there needs to be a quote denaturalization process. And I tried asking him follow-up questions about that, but he didn't take questions from reporters. Previous Penn Live reporting has also shown how just ICE has cast a wide net when it comes to deportations, for example. But at the conference itself, people told me that they were happy about how the borders were tightened in under President Trump compared to President Biden. So I had a lot of people talking to me about how they were a lot happier about the immigration policies under the current president as compared to previous administrations.
All right, Teresa, thank you very much. Now let's turn our attention to the race for governor that's coming up. And Jackson, I want to get you involved because I know that Shapiro's opponent, Stacey Garrity, held a fundraiser at Trump's place in Florida. And how productive was that fundraiser for her campaign?
For Treasurer Garrity, it was a good experience to put herself in front of these, Republican mega donors that are down in Florida. Her campaign said that it was a sold-out fundraiser. Donald Trump stopped by. She published a couple of videos of him speaking there and criticizing her opponent, Josh Shapiro. But when it came to the numbers, it's unclear what a success that would be and how her campaign would gauge that. The recent campaign finance numbers show that Shapiro, as of March 30th, had about $36 million in the bank. And that's compared to Treasurer Garrity's $1.5 million. So there's a huge gap there that Treasurer Garrity should probably try and look to close moving forward. It's still so early in the race. I mean, technically, Garrity isn't even the nominee yet. And she's been holding a lot more public events recently, I've noticed. But it's still not looking good for her. Money isn't everything also in the race, but it does, it pays for ads, it pays for travel, it pays for staff. It is a major focus of these campaigns. And a lot of the political scientists and political analysts that I spoke to said that there's really a snowball effect with the money that's coming in this early in the race. If you have a lot of money right now, it indicates to other donors that there's traction with your campaign and really tells them whether they should invest in you as a candidate. And on the other hand, if you don't have a lot of money, it's the opposite effect. It shows people that your campaign might not be worth one investing in if there is such a large disparity. So it'll be interesting to see how much money Treasurer Garrity can work to bring in after these slow first couple of months of the year.
Well, like you said, Jackson, Garrity at this time is not the nominee. We expect her to be, but at this time she's not. Furthermore, Governor Shapiro won't have a primary either. So do all these recent fundraising efforts just get banked for the general election?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of this money won't be spent until the final month of the campaign, but it's, as I mentioned, the snowball effect, of course, and then they're still spending money right now. Treasurer Garrity specifically spent, I think it was just over $500,000, and more than half of that was in mailers going to voters asking for more money. Governor Shapiro, on the other hand, spent almost $5 million. I think it was more than $4 million. Mostly on digital ads. So they are actively campaigning and doing their outreach right now. So it's still early, like I said, but money is always at the center of this.
Now, it's interesting to consider, Jackson, that Stacey Garrity has mounted 2 successful campaigns to be the treasurer in Pennsylvania. So how is running for governor, fundraising-wise, a horse of a different color?
Well, she mostly kept a low-key profile of fundraising as treasurer too. So that is what some Republicans are saying. Like, don't count her out. She's done this before. But polling at this point, again, it's early, but polling at this point does not favor Garrity. Shapiro is up in most polls by 15 to 20% margins over Garrity. So it's different than running for governor is different than running for treasurer, but I do think that no one can count her out. She is the highest vote earner of any candidate in Pennsylvania history. She took that record in 2022 or 2024 from Governor Josh Shapiro when he won in 2022. So it's very early. It's still not looking great for Garrity, but things can turn around very quick.
Let's continue to talk about the election and consider a U.S. congressman that is running for re-election, and that would be Rob Bresnahan. And Boris, you did a story about Paige Cognetti, his opponent, coming out. She gave a news conference during which she denounced her opponent, Bresnahan. What did she say?
Well, she's basically saying that he's in it for himself because he's promised not to trade stocks while he's a congressman, and he traded stocks while he's a congressman. In fact, he was at one point the most prolific trader of stocks as a congressman in his first year in office. He has struggled to explain this. He has, now proposed a stock ban. He signed on to a stock ban that doesn't seem to be getting any traction in the House, and she's going to continue to beat him over the head with it for the next year. She's got Mark Kelly coming in this weekend for her in Luzerne County, and I'm sure they're going to talk about that, and I'm sure that we're going to keep hearing about that. She is in a pretty good position to unseat him because it's so far shaping up as a Democratic year. The polling, we mentioned that Josh Shapiro is doing well in the polling, and basically the generic congressional polling shows the Democrats substantially ahead. This is a race that in many previous years, maybe the incumbent has an advantage, but it's hard to see it right now in that particular race. It is going to be one of the most heavily contested races in the country. Mike Johnson has been in the region, was here last year raising money for Bresnahan. I'm sure we're going to see more of that. There's going to be tens of millions of dollars spent just on that race.
Boris, give us some more background on this recent event of Paige Cognetti criticizing Bresnahan. How did Cognetti get this information on which to base her recent accusations?
There was a story that started in the New York Times last year that basically pointed out that Bresnahan had written a letter to the editor while he was running for Congress in 2024 to a local newspaper. And in it, he said that, congressmen shouldn't trade stocks. They should ban stock trading. And then when he got to office, that didn't happen. He became the most prolific stock trader, and the New York Times picked up on that and turned that into a major story. And it's been haunting him ever since.
And just so our viewers understand, Boris, what can a person like Bresnahan learn as a congressman that could benefit him financially? Any insight there?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's always, just say up front, he says he's never traded on any of his inside information, but very often congressmen know things, legislation's going to move that may affect the way the economy performs. And there's certainly that, if they're going to pass a bill or if they're going to, repeal legislation, then and there's already accusations by the Cognetti campaign that he knew that they were going to take away money from Medicaid. And so that he sold his stock in companies that rely on Medicaid. There's already accusations of that. So there's an issue that's going to follow him all year long. The Republicans are trying to put together a case against her as being personally corrupt and, running a city that's haunted by crime. We'll see how that plays out.
Tirza, let's get you involved again and consider a story you wrote about lawmakers' spending transparency. First, let's just look at this from a general point of view, kind of a view from 20,000 feet. Why should the public be interested in the legal bills of its legislature?
Absolutely. Yeah, so one, it's a big amount and there is no transparency involved. So I'll talk about my findings, but Pennsylvania taxpayers spent almost $10 million for private lawyers, and the Senate spent about $9.3 million of that, and the House spent about half a million. So there's a big disparity there. But taxpayers specifically, I think, I believe should be interested in this just because, one, there is no bidding process. So
Mhm.
lawyers are kind of handpicked, and there is no public bidding process, but also, um, uh, all six top lawmakers, so I'm talking both from the House and Senate leadership, they pocketed about $857,000 in campaign finance
Mhm.
donations from most of the law firms that were hired during the same time period that I analyzed
Mhm.
for my project.
Mhm.
One expense that both government officials, past government officials, and legal experts questioned were a $395,000 charge for a criminal defense attorney to represent Senator Doug Mastriano from Franklin County, related to a Jan 6th federal grand jury investigation.
Mhm.
And so when I found that finding and I mentioned it to, I ran it by legal experts and ethics experts to understand whether they thought, this should be something that should have been publicly disclosed, and they all
Mhm.
answered yes. So that's a short answer to your question.
Well, Tirza, our time is limited. Let me ask you about one of the bigger expenses recorded that was acknowledged in your story, and it involved the Speaker of the House, Joanna McClinton. It was in 2022. Try to tell us briefly what happened there.
Absolutely, yeah. So in November of 2022, this was more than a decade after the House Democrats got a one-person majority in the House. So they got a majority in the House, and then um, two lawmakers resigned and then one passed away. So the House Speaker issued special elections to get those positions filled. And the previous House Speaker, Republican Brian Cutler from Lancaster County, sued McClellan, saying that she overstepped her authority by
Mhm.
issuing those elections. Ended up costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal
Mhm.
bills. And what happened was the court found that McClinton did act within her authority, and those three positions were filled. So yeah.
All right, we have just a minute left, and maybe it's enough time, Jackson, for you to explain recent developments that have to do with family and medical leave. There's a bill passed that would give employees paid leave and benefits, and try to take a minute and sum that up for us.
Yeah, I'll go quick. So the Democratic-led House passed a bill. It was passed along bipartisan lines. It would require employers to provide 12 weeks of paid leave for parents, victims of violent acts, and individuals facing or recovering from a serious health condition. There's a similar proposal in the GOP-run Senate from Devlin Robinson of Allegheny County. But you know, there's a lot of hope here from advocates who've been fighting for this for the past couple of years. There have been bills since for 7 years, or at least, to pass this type of legislation. Pennsylvania, um, I think it's about two-thirds of Pennsylvanians, according to some of the lawmakers and advocates, two-thirds of PA's workforce doesn't have paid leave. And that's something they're hoping to rectify with this. Lawmakers are a little divided, largely along partisan lines, about how to pay for this. The House proposal is an entirely employer-funded program, and the Senate wants employees to fund it. So
Mhm.
a lot of the advocates that say that they think they'll meet somewhere in the middle with a mix of contributions from both.
Our guests have been Jackson White from Spotlight, PA, Boris Krotchniuk from WVIA, and Tirza Christopher from Penn Live. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like the Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.